Bring up the text. Happy birthday to Soph. Yeah, I'll bring him in at some point when he's a little bit better. I want to talk about a bunch of things today. I want to talk about Denmark Vesey. I want to talk about the corrupt bargain, or corrupt bargains, plural. I want to talk about Jacksonian democracy and the second party system. All this stuff together. And so if you've read the chapter this week, here is a place where I absolutely, definitely depart from the textbook, because the textbook, as I'm sure you read, is all about the market revolution and the sort of market revolution in the 1820s and 1830s. And if you've been reading the textbook closely before, you see that there's a market revolution in almost every decade in the textbook. So I think that there is no such thing as a market revolution. I don't think that there's a massive change in the way that the market works and people's relationship to the market. I don't think that there's a market revolution at all, and I do think that what happens in this period is an important divergence between the North and the South in terms of credit. Very strong differences in terms of people's feelings about the Bank of the United States, but no market revolution. What I want to argue is that people's relationship to credit changes, and that is important for understanding the tensions in the Jacksonian period. Okay, so let me start today by talking about Denmark Vesey. And to do that, we have to talk about this dude, Rufus King, who is, remember I said that after the War of 1812, which ends in 1815, that there is no Federalist Party, right? The Federalist Party is basically gone as a party. Why? Because the Federalists support the British. The Federalists actually right before the War of 1812, talk about, the New England Federalists talk about seceding from the United States, which looks very, very bad once the United States gets into a war with Great Britain. And so the Federalist Party falls apart, except for this dude, Rufus King, who is a U.S. Senator from New York. He is... what about him? I think he signed the Declaration of Independence. He was an initial signer of the Constitution, and so he had a great deal of support in New York. And so he's a Federalist. he doesn't care that his party is gone. Basically, he doesn't run as any party in particular. He doesn't call himself a Federalist, but he continues to run and he continues to win. And he's basically a person without a party. And so Federalist FTW, I hope you know what that expression means. It's basically, I'm a Federalist. I don't care what you think. I'm going to do and say whatever I want. This is interesting and important because he writes in 1819, when people are talking about the Missouri Compromise, and you read about the Missouri Compromise last week, and the Missouri Compromise basically admits Missouri as a slave state, admits Maine as a free state, and more or less establishes this line of 3630 that says that there's going to be slavery south of 3630 and no slavery north of 3630, right? Rufus King has had it with the pro-slavery folks in Congress, and he writes this intemperate speech in which he says slavery is a blot on the Constitution. Slavery is a terrible thing. He says basically that the Founding Fathers didn't believe in slavery. They objected to slavery. People who are slaveholders have way too much power. All right. Now, the significance of this is that speech is published in Niles Register, which is the magazine that publishes the speeches of congressmen. And if you imagine, today when you pick up a magazine, I don't know if you guys still read magazines, but magazines in this period, in the 1820s, tended to have speeches by Congress people, in part because Congress people then were pretty good speechwriters, in part because a lot of people were very concerned about what was sort of going on. And so Niles Register is a sort of like People magazine of the 1820s, and it publishes this speech by Rufus King because it's delivered in Congress and because it's an intemperate speech. The person who reads it is this guy on the left, and this is a sort of reconstruction. We don't know exactly what Denmark Vesey was, but Rufus King's remarks are printed in a pamphlet. And if you look here, yeah, Niles Register. It's basically a register of the debates in Congress. So it's called Niles Register. And it was one of the most popular magazines. Hey, JGR, one of the most popular magazines in the 18 teens and 1820s. And it's distributed throughout the country. And they're publicly available anywhere, and certainly in the coastal city of Charleston. And it's there that a free black man named Denmark Vesey discovers it. And if you look here, what I've highlighted, this is a sentence that comes from this angry Rufus King. Slavery unhappily exists within the United States. Enlightened men in the state where it is permitted, and everyone out of them regret its existence among us, and seek for the means of limiting and of mitigating it. The first introduction of slaves is not imputable to the present generation, nor even to their ancestors. And he goes on to say that it's in 1620 probably, or 1619, in which enslaved people are brought over. And Virginia, to its credit, doesn't support slavery. Okay, this is very interesting in a slave regime. This is very interesting in Charleston. And Charleston, at this point, is a pretty permissive place. And the coast has malarial mosquitoes, as I talked about before. And in the summer months, most slaveholders come to Charleston with on their own. The enslaved people who are in the field are left alone to work in the estates. The enslaved people in Charleston are also skilled laborers, and many white workers refuse to go to South Carolina, and so most skilled occupations are occupied by black men and women. There were very few free blacks in the lower South, but the very few that existed were in Charleston. 57% of Charleston was black, and almost 1 in 8 were free. So it's got a large number of free black people in Charleston. Enslaved mechanics could hire out their labor, and slave domestics were allowed to read and write. Black worshipers were allowed to form exclusive religious congregations. Charleston, as the American South goes, is a pretty liberal place at this time, in 1819. Vesey, Denmark Vesey, was a free black man who denied many of the stories that slaveholders themselves had told about slavery. He was biracial. He was a product of a relationship that was supposed to be rare. Oh, sorry. Denmark Vesey. He was an excellent carpenter and thus not untrainable, like apologist Clay. Oh yes, absolutely against slavery. He had, in fact, many enslaved wives and children. He had multiple wives and multiple children, and sort of not the kind of Christian family that enslavers believed that they created. So he was himself free, but is that right? Hold on a second. Bear with me for a second. Yes, he was himself free, but he had enslaved wives and children. He believed that slavery was wrong, and he had read this message from, yes, he did. His closest friend was Monday Gell. And so he has multiple wives in part because it's not legal for enslaved people to marry. And so he has multiple partners in Charleston. His closest friend was Monday Gell. I'll spell that. Monday Gell, who and the name Monday is it was common sort of African tradition to be named after the day of the week in which you were born, and so this tradition is carried on in South Carolina. A hired out enslaved person who ran his own harness shop and paid his owner with the proceeds. So his closest friend was enslaved, but who basically more or less lived as free. He sold his labor to other people and then paid the person who technically owned him. Yes. So Vesey was against slavery, but his wife, and in part that was because he couldn't free them. He didn't have enough money to free them. He believed that they should be free, but they were enslaved in Charleston. Yeah, it's a confusing. We want to draw these sort of sharp lines here, but this was the life that he lived. He had partners, but they were enslaved. He had children, but because his wives were enslaved, they were slaves as well. Oh, right, that's right. So they weren't his wives; they were the wives of others. Yeah. Yeah, sorry about that. No, he didn't own them himself. I don't think. Okay, so Vesey, the story is that Vesey apparently sought to round up slaves in Charleston to revolt against their masters, and he reads them sections of the Declaration of Independence, and then he reads them these lines and other lines from Rufus King's intemperate speech against slavery. Those who and he this apparently plans an insurrection in Charleston. Now, there's some debate among historians about whether there really was an insurrection or not. Um, some historians said that the insurrection was just didn't really happen. It's at least planned, certainly. Those who were not convinced, according to later testimony by enslaved people, he gave the choice to either join or we will kill you. The plan was to go in two stages. First, a dozen black men would raid the Charleston arsenal at midnight with clubs, hoes, and pikes. The armory was not guarded, and one of the conspirators actually had a key. Then the plan was that these dozen black men would take up the captured guns and bring them to outside of Charleston, where a slave revolt would begin. The plan after that was hazy. Some people spoke of sailing off to Haiti before reinforcements could arrive. And it is clear that something is happening between Monday Gel and Denmark Vesey. There does seem to be a planned insurrection. Some historians say that it was never likely to succeed. Okay. What's interesting about Charleston is its location, right? It's on this peninsula. It's surrounded by water. It's an excellent port, but many of the people who are navigators in this port are black men. The people who know the little shoals and if you look at this area here, there are all these places that where there are rocks and shoals and big sandbars and things like that. And to navigate and steer around them requires a whole lot of knowledge of the place, as well as sort of an understanding of how to move. And it's the people who know the harbor best, in most cases, are black men who have been moving up and down these harbors for multiple periods. So if one has a ship that's going to come into Charleston, you often have to bring a black man aboard who tells you which way to go. Okay, and so it's apparent that Denmark Vesey relies on these men, or seems to rely on these men, to transmit this conspiracy around Charleston. Then late May of 1822, and this is when the insurrection is supposed to begin, a month before the scheduled revolution, Ned Bennett, who is enslaved person owned by the governor Thomas Bennett, approaches a house servant, who then betrays the two of them. And he's originally not believed. Ned Bennett then goes to the mayor of Charleston and tells him that it's all a misunderstanding. There's no slave insurrection. Slaveholders in town get together in Charleston and discuss it and decide that it's impossible. Vesey, though, becomes uneasy and moves the revolt up 2 weeks. A few days before the raid was planned, they were turned in again a second time. It's at this point that Governor Bennett, who's on the peninsula, calls in hundreds of white troops. Vesey, at the same time, sends a man out into the country to tell the countryside recruits, who he has apparently organized, to march in. But this man was quickly caught by slave patrols. Okay, so that's the extent of the Denmark Vesey insurrection. It's not really an insurrection, as some people said. It's a planned insurrection. It seems to fail. But here was the problem that slaveholders discovered as they start to investigate this possible insurrection. Enslaved men and women who were involved were rounded up. Some were cooks, others were house servants. Elias Horry was an enslaver who believed that the people that he owned would never do such a thing. When his coachman was accused before the constables, he turned to his coachman and said, "Are you guilty?" "Yes," he muttered. "What were your intentions?" he said. To kill you, rip open your belly, and throw your guts in your face." So this is the Denmark's Vesey insurrection. It ultimately fails. 35 people are executed. 34 are deported out of South Carolina to islands and elsewhere. The results of the apparent right, right, yeah. As you can imagine, the anger that these people have is pretty intense, and so the plan is in fact to kill people. That's what many slave insurrections are not peaceful things. It's not just an end of slavery. They're often, the plan is ultimately to kill the people who have enslaved them. Right. That's the thing, is that the story that they tell themselves, the way in which the enslavers get themselves to go to sleep at night is, well, these people are happy in the position that they're in. They persuaded themselves of that, and many of the enslaved people, are in part as a way of self-protection, are going to play dumb, are going to not suggest that they're unhappy with enslavement. Okay, so what does this apparent insurrection do in South Carolina? Well, first of all, the one result is that throughout the South, after the 1822, teaching enslaved people to read becomes illegal. So it is no longer legal to teach enslaved people to read. Many black women and men in Charleston, enslaved and free, could read, and this was seen as being dangerous because it allowed things like this to spread. It allowed speeches, anti-slavery speeches like Rufus King's, to be widely distributed and then form the basis for a slave revolt. So teaching slaves to enslaved people to read becomes illegal in 1822 throughout the South. Secondly, free blacks are seen as dangerous. And so many states pass laws. Every southern state passes a law saying that freed slaves must leave the state or be sharply restricted in their activities. Yes, it was illegal, and it becomes it's actually a felony in South Carolina. In other states, it's a misdemeanor, but it basically becomes illegal for anyone to teach anyone to read, and even an enslaved person who could read, became illegal for them to teach other enslaved people to read. This is why Sunday schools are so unpopular. And they initially proposed in the 1820s and 1830s, very, very popular in Great Britain. But Sunday schools are basically barred in the South because Sunday schools are all about teaching you to read the Bible. And and people who own slaves don't want enslaved people to read because they'll read. You read that Moses, right, leads the people out of the land of Israel and leads them to freedom. They'll read the Old Testament, which has lots of revolutions in it, and come to believe that that slavery is wrong. Let my people go, Moses says, and so there are parts of the Bible that are very, very disturbing, as you can imagine, and form great source for for slave revolts. Okay, so free blacks are seen as dangerous. Freed slaves must leave the country or leave the state. Leave the state. And there's growing Southern opposition to a national state among people who own slaves, and this has to do with basically the South Carolina's attempt to respond to Denmark Vesey. And so sorry about the graininess of that, but in South Carolina in December of 1822, after this apparent revolt, or planned revolt, South Carolina passes what's called the Negro Seamen's Act in December of 1822. And it says that black seamen, the people who are, any black man who's on a ship that comes into Charleston, must, as long as the ship is in the harbor, those black seamen must wait in jail while they're in Charleston. So they cannot travel freely. So a British ship that comes into Charleston, a French ship that comes into Charleston, if any of the crew are black, those black men, as long as the ship is in the harbor, have to wait in a jail until the ship leaves again. Does that make sense? They're not allowed to travel freely. Why? Because these people could potentially transmit information about the fact that slavery is not legal in other parts of the United States, the fact that slavery is not legal in France, the fact that slavery is people in Britain, for example, don't like slavery. And so this Negro Seamen's Act is a state law that basically imposes limits on what black people can do. This law comes into conflict, or is the Federal Circuit Court considers this law in 1823 and 1824, and they consider overturning it because it seems to impose limitations on foreigners. It seems to impose limitations on people from other states. Okay, so that's where. So it's in this conflict over the Negro Seamen's Act. What was the last result? Oh, the last result was growing Southern opposition to a national state, a strong national state. Does that make sense? Okay. Basically, what we're going to come to call states' rights. Okay. So that's where Gibbons versus Ogden comes in. Now, the cartoon I used last time was pretty terrible. So let me just briefly go over Gibbons versus Ogden. It's called the Emancipation Proclamation for American Business because it basically prevents states from having monopolies, particularly when interstate commerce is involved. Okay, so very quickly, Ogden has a New Jersey license to travel back and forth between New Jersey and New York. Gibbons says he does not need a license because the Federal Coasting Act says that there can be no monopolies in the coasting trade, so that one state can't bar another state from trading. And so Gibbons says he doesn't need a license. Ogden arrests Gibbons. Gibbons appeals to the state court and then the Federal Supreme Court. And so this case starts in 1819 and finishes in 1824. In 1819, there are lots of Southerners who don't really have an opinion about federal law versus state law. But after Denmark Vesey, there's increasingly fear on the part of Southerners, white slaveholding Southerners, that an overreaching federal government could be a problem. And in the end, Gibbons wins. If the federal government legislates on something, like the Federal Coasting Act, it wins over the state. What that means is that individual states can't have monopolies. Individual states can't have bans or can't impose patent law or other kinds of laws. Part of the New Jersey licensing thing was an attempt to create a monopoly for steamboats. And so in Gibbons versus Ogden, the solution is the federal government wins. It wins over the state. But what it implies, though, is that the Negro Seamen's Act is okay because there's no federal legislation. So there's no federal legislation that says black men can go about their business and not be regulated by states. Okay, does that make sense? So it's basically an attempt by the Supreme Court to sort of not to limit the power of states, but not where slavery is concerned. Not where the protection of those states from the dangerous ideas is concerned. And so it's a very limited decision. It's a very powerful decision in terms of preventing states from monopolies, but it's a very limited decision in that it says that police regulations and things like that can be upheld by states, including the Negro Seamen's Act. So the Negro Seamen's Act stands in South Carolina, but the New Jersey monopoly on steamboats fails. This makes enslavers increasingly anxious. They want and desire states to nullify state legislation, and they increasingly fear federal power because they fear that any regulation of interstate trade could effectively interfere with the system of slavery. Does that make sense? How this works? So John Marshall is another Federalist. John Marshall is the head of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He's a Federalist. His party is dead. He is a slave, an enslaver. He has slaves himself, but he believes in a strong national government. And yet, he understands that many people who own slaves don't want a strong federal government. Yeah, it's basically it's what the claim in Gibbons versus Ogden is states have the power to legislate, provided there is no federal legislation. Okay, so states can do what they want if there's not federal legislation that contradicts it. If federal legislation contradicts it, then the federal government wins. If there's no federal legislation, then the state can do what it wants. Does that make sense? So what this means is that state regulations, like South Carolina saying no enslaved people can't read, that's acceptable as long as there's no federal law that says you can't prevent people from reading. Okay? So what that does is it basically it allows the state to have important powers that are not mentioned directly in the Constitution, provided that there's no federal legislation. Okay, so this is an attempt by Congress, by the Supreme Court, to sort of tiptoe around this increasingly problematic issue that in which there are free states and slave states. Okay. All right. Let me give you some background of what's changing and why it is that people who own slaves are increasingly concerned. And oops, sorry, this is cut off. Okay, outside the United States. Now, this book was supposed to be the U.S. in the world, and it talks about some of these things. But outside the United States, slavery is in trouble, right? In 1804, Haiti is founded, and slavery is abolished over time. In 1814, the British leave what's called the Negro Fort in Florida in the hands of the former slaves. So Negro Fort is in Florida, this part of Florida, right around Pensacola. I don't know if you can see my cursor there, but right around Pensacola, the British leave Florida, but they leave this thing called what they call the Negro Fort in the hands of the formerly enslaved. So we see the Seminoles and others developing in Florida, which is a combination of Seminole Indians and enslaved people who have escaped from Georgia and Alabama and elsewhere. So there seems, while slavery, technically still exists, it doesn't really exist in Florida, and so there are lots of people who leave to Florida, particularly when it's in the hands of the British, and slavery is de facto almost gone in Florida in 1815, 1816, 1817. And it's a place where people who run away from slavery end up. In 1821, New Spain declares the Plan of Iguala declares independence, creating an independent Mexico. So Mexico basically separates from the Spanish Empire, and it declares slavery abolished. It doesn't entirely abolish slavery in Mexico, but it declares it's abolished. So there's still kind of bound labor of some sort in Mexico, but formal slavery is gone in Mexico in 1821. And so that means, again, that enslaved people from Louisiana, provided they can move far enough south and west, can escape to slavery in this period. In 1821, then Gran Colombia, which is all the way down here, formerly New Granada, begins gradual abolition. And then when New Spain becomes independent, slavery is abolished. Okay, sorry. 1821 is New Spain abolishes slavery. 1829, independent Mexico abolishes slavery. Okay? And then in 1833, slavery is abolished in the British Caribbean. So slavery is being kind of worn away over this period, particularly in the Latin American countries that are separating from their mother country after the United States Revolution. Okay. So this is the kind of anxious world that people who own enslaved people are in, where they worry about people reading, enslaved people reading, where they worry about enslaved people worshiping separately, where they worry about enslaved people. Yes, it did. So it's this basically the Spanish colonies all have revolutions between 1809 and 1820 or so, and most of them abolish slavery at the same time. So they have revolutions from Spain and Brazil's a little bit of a different situation because the king actually moves to Brazil. But yeah, there are revolutions in Spain that are strong in the Spanish colonies that are strongly influenced by the American Revolution. Okay. So another thing that makes people who enslave other people anxious is the price of cotton leads to a boom bust cycle in the South. Cotton prices, as you can see here, that yellow line, are zooming up and down like crazy in this period between, say, I don't know, 1810 and 1850. Cotton prices are like on a yo-yo, going up and down. And these cotton prices, the reason for cotton prices go up and down has relatively little to do with the United States and lots to do with Great Britain. Great Britain's ability to sell cotton goods, technological changes taking place in cotton. Manchester and Liverpool don't need a lot of cotton, and then suddenly they do, and then suddenly they don't. A whole British empire is being formed by using cotton exports in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, and so the cotton prices are going up and down. uh, and there are and so there are surges in desire for Indian land as cotton prices go up. There's a push for westward settlement. So when cotton prices shoot up after 1810, particularly around 1814, 1815, there's a surge of westward movement in the South. Cotton prices drop again from 1815 to 1825, and then they surge up again in 1832 to 38, and again there's a surge of westward movement, and that's when we get Indian removal. That's where we get Andrew Jackson pushing for Indians to be removed from Georgia and Alabama. And then again in the 1850s, cotton prices start to creep back up, and again there's push for a surge in westward movement. So westward movement follows this. Desire for Indian land follows this. The price of enslaved people, which is the thing down here, goes up and down based on the cotton prices, which is a kind of horrible thing, right? That what one costs, what a person costs, the value of a person who happens to be enslaved, goes up and down based on cotton prices. And then it increasingly, credit is necessary for people who want to own large plantations, but it's easy to fail because if one were to establish a plantation and buy a large number of slaves and then the cotton price drops, they are likely to fail. If they fail, those enslaved people are then, their families are broken up and spread out all over the place. So there's a tremendous amount of misery that comes from this up and down for cotton prices. Lots and lots of families broken up. Sometimes when prices go up, sometimes when prices go down. Okay, so there's a lot of chaos that comes about from this sort of boom and bust. A lot of fear that comes about from this boom and bust. Okay. So now I want to talk about politics and what this does to politics. Remember that the end of the War of 1812 gives us the era of good feelings from 1815 or so to 1819, about 4 years. Yeah, it's sort of too complicated to explain, but basically, because there's a lot of there's supply issues too. There's a whole lot of cotton supply that goes up, and then so it's difficult to say exactly what's causing it. It's a mixture of supply and demand. Cotton prices go down when there's a huge supply and a low demand. Cotton prices go up when there's a low supply and a huge demand. So part of this is happening in the United States. because there are a whole lot of cotton that's being produced, and part of this is happening in Britain, where suddenly Britain doesn't need a lot of cotton, or when suddenly it does. So it's an international market, and like any international market, it's going to go up and down based on things that you don't even know about, right? You don't even know that I don't know, the 1850s, the Sepoy revolt in India is going to lead to the destruction of cotton manufacturing in India, and as a result, a real increased demand for cotton. Yeah, it's an early stock market. It's exactly like that. Yeah, this is like Bitcoin or something. It's very up and down. Okay, so what happens then in the election of 1824? The Panic of 1819 has happened. A lot of people have failed because of the Panic of 1819, particularly in the Northwest, places that are growing wheat, but also Virginia, which is exporting a lot of flour. A lot of places are in trouble, and we get 4 different candidates for the election of 1824. So much for the era of good feelings. The election of 1824 is definitely the end of the era of good feelings, because we have 4 different people who all call themselves Democratic Republicans who are running for the presidency. Okay. In the lower South, especially Georgia, but also parts of Virginia, we see the presidential candidate here on the left, William H. Crawford. He had been the Secretary of Treasury under Madison. He's called a radical, but he's not a radical because he's not a communist or anything like that. He's a radical states' rightist, right? These men claim to be the heirs of Thomas Jefferson. They favor a very small government, okay? And so he says he's the only Jeffersonian in the group. He opposes internal improvements. He opposes federally sponsored railroads. He opposes federally sponsored canals. He believes that the government should be as cheap as possible. During the campaign, William Crawford has a stroke. His arms and legs get rigid. He can barely talk. The radicals continue to support him, and some even claim that he's the perfect candidate because the president shouldn't really do much anyways. Okay? This is kind of grim story, but Crawford is still a candidate and still wins a lot of votes, even though he's basically effectively crippled and can barely get around after his stroke. Why would some people support states' rights? Why would if you're imagining the Panic of 1824, Panic of 1819, you're thinking about what happened. You're thinking about the price of cotton and stuff like that. Why would white slaveholders, particularly in Georgia and Virginia, favor somebody like William Crawford, somebody who's radically states' rightist? What's the attraction of this? All right, they support slavery, so they don't want the federal government to interfere. Excellent. Other things. Yeah, they want, right. So they won't mess with them, right? So the idea is that the state is the primary source of responsibility, and the federal government won't intervene. These are also people who might blame the bust on an overactive federal government, right? They might blame the bust on a government that's too committed to tariffs. That when it imposes tariffs on Great Britain, Britain responds by imposing tariffs back, and too strong a federal government is likely to lead to a boom and bust. When they're facing a boom and bust cycle, they might blame a strong federal government for it. Other issues? But yeah, a big one is slavery. A big one is defending slavery, a fear that the federal government is going to interfere with slavery. Okay, so that's William Crawford, William H. Crawford. In Kentucky, we see Henry Clay on the right, a riverboat gambler, made his money gambling on riverboats. He studied at the feet of George Wythe of Virginia. He's born in Virginia, and his father dies when he's young. he becomes a successful Kentucky politician. Like Marshall of the Supreme Court, he is a centralizer. He believes in a strong central government. In fact, George Wythe, this Henry Clay's teacher, was John Marshall's teacher as well. Both of them support a strong central government. He supports internal improvements. His vision is of northern and southern capitalists joining hands and building a centralized nation top down. He believes that there should be a national bank for extending credit for westward expansion. Okay? If you're in Kentucky, why would you be likely to support Henry Clay? Or if you're in, where else? Missouri, Kentucky or Missouri, why would you be likely to support Henry Clay? What's the attraction of somebody like Henry Clay? A nationalizer, supporter of internal improvements and things like that. What's in it for you? Kentucky is a slaveholding regime. Missouri is a slaveholding regime. What's the attraction? That's a good question. I don't know. Let's see. I think the anti-Masonic Party was. I don't know. I don't remember. Okay, so most westward expansion comes through these states, and they want roads, right? They want rivers. They want canals. They want to connect to the east, right? Right. They wanted things they couldn't accomplish by themselves, right? These people in the West don't have a lot. People in the East have a great deal of money. People in the West don't have a lot of money. So they want a federal government that's going to support them and bind them to the rest of the country. They need big things, and those big things can't be accomplished in Kentucky. They can't be accomplished in Missouri, places that are just a dozen years away from being territories. So they need a strong government of some sort to connect them to the rest of the world. They want something like an Erie Canal. Okay. So that's Henry Clay and William Crawford. The other two candidates, one of them will be somewhat familiar to you, is Andrew Jackson. He is the hero of the New Orleans campaign, right? Yeah. He's an Indian fighter. He is not, unlike everybody else here, he is not a big reader. He is grows up poor, right on the border between North and South Carolina. He's the first he's the first warrior president without much political experience. George Washington had political experience. Andrew Jackson does not. He is basically a soldier. He has been a legislator. He has a little bit of knowledge of Washington. He's considered a gentleman, even though he is not especially every. How do we put this? Every letter he's ever written has got spelling and grammatical errors. Okay, so this is not someone who is born to write. He has little knowledge of. Right? He's a layman's candidate. Right. And so people identify with him. Soldiers identify with him. People in the West see him as being somebody like themselves. See his, in a way, his lack of literacy and his lack of, polish make him very attractive and very interesting. So particularly to men who themselves maybe are from poor families. He was an Indian fighter who was in the English army in the 1760s initially. The story is that he has a scar on his head from being whipped with a sword for not cleaning a British officer's boots, and that's probably the case. That a British officer asked him. Right? Didn't know that so he had been told by a British officer to clean his boots. He allegedly said no, and he was whipped with a sword, and he still has the scars on it later in his life. His mother dies during the Revolution, ministering to soldiers on a slave ship. And during the Revolution, he learns the tricks from Native people that he's close to. Now, this is we see Andrew Jackson as being strongly anti-Indian because of his Indian removal policies later, but it's a little complicated. Andrew Jackson did adopt a Creek boy who was orphaned and raises him as his own son. He sees himself as being kind of akin to Native people. I mean, it's kind of disturbing to think about now, but he learns many of the techniques from Native peoples, particularly the Creeks and the Cherokees, about ambush, about selective fire, and these sorts of things. He in fact uses these Native techniques against Native people in the 1820s, and so he's an interesting and difficult and problematic character, but one that people see as a kind of hero, and so see him as very somewhat attractive. And then finally, the fourth candidate, is John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams is John Adams' son. He's yeah, exactly. No, I mean he actually of all the four candidates, he probably knows more Creek words than any of them. He probably knows more Cherokee words than any of them. He probably knows more about those societies than any of these other three candidates. I don't want to make this guy a hero at all, but it's important to understand that he is seen as a backwoodsman, right? He's seen as somebody who represents a sort of backwoods America, okay? And this is a little bit different from, kind of very different from William Crawford, right? Who is from an elite family, who is from an old slaveholding plantation. Andrew Jackson is himself a slaveholder and he enslaves people, but he's not to the manor born, and he's not one of these rich slaveholders himself, the son of slaveholders. John Quincy Adams is descendant of John Adams, a professional statesman, but a terrible politician. He's in the tradition of the old presidents, statesman-like, stiff, and well-educated. He thinks that America's problems all stem from the caterpillar banks, that the caterpillar banks were the biggest problem, that all these Western banks were a mistake, a terrible mistake, and that a strong federal government is the solution to the problem. So they're four very different views of the world. And let's take a look at this map so you can get a sense of them. And what I'd like to do is put these characters at the four kind of compass portions, although it doesn't exactly quite work. So Clay, in a certain sense, if you look at here, he's the yellow candidate. He represents, to the extent that we can say, it represents a region. He represents the Northwest, as you can see up here, those peach areas. Missouri, Kentucky, Ohio. Those are the regions that, and this is called the Old Northwest, and this is where Clay is from. And these are regions that believe that they need internal improvements. They believe that a strong national state is going to connect them to the rest of the country. Notice that they're not necessarily free states in the Northwest. Kentucky is a slave state. Missouri is a slave state. Ohio is not a slave state. So this is Henry Clay's world, is the Northwest, the Old Northwest. John Quincy Adams, as you can see, pulls very, very strongly in the Northeast, right? Particularly New England, not New York. Actually, he does win New York. But particularly New England. He also does well in New York in 1824. I didn't realize that. Okay, he gets a lot of votes in New York, actually. Apology. So New York and New England are kind of his homestays. He's educated at Harvard. He's seen as believes in a kind of strong federal government, and believes in that the cause of the Panic of 1819 was those caterpillar banks, and that a strong Bank of the United States is a very good thing. Okay. The Southeast, sort of, Virginia, Georgia. He does decently in South Carolina, but he doesn't win, is Crawford. Crawford, who believes in states' rights. He also believes in a weak federal government, at the same time that he believes that the Second Bank of the United States is an important institution. And that's probably why he does so well in Virginia and South Carolina, is he does very well with the old slave-owning planters who like the Second Bank of the United States because it provides them with credit. Okay? And then we have Andrew Jackson in the West, the Southwest. He believes that the Bank of the United States is the source of the 1819 panic. He believes, though, that there should be a strong national government, but that it should be strongest in the Army, and that the Army should be in charge of Indian removal. The Army should be in charge of expanding to the West. Clay Jackson was the one who believes in states' rights. So Crawford believes in states' rights primarily. Neither Clay nor Jackson are really states' rights folks. Jackson believes that there are powers that are reserved to the states, and that there ought to be some powers that are reserved to the states. But Jackson is a nationalizer. He just believes in a national army, in a way, that a national army should be strongly supported and allowed to clear away Indians from the West. So that's, it's Clay up here in the corner, Jackson down here in the Southwest, Adams in the Northeast, Crawford in the Southeast. That's one way of thinking about how these four work. And that election of 1824 is crazy, right? All four candidates claim to be Democratic Republicans. All four candidates are running. Nobody wins. Jackson gets the largest share of the electoral votes with 38%, and definitely the largest share of the popular votes, 43%. But it's basically a four-way split with no one in the lead. In the end, none of them gets enough votes, and as a result, this goes to the House. The House of Representatives. Article 2, Section 1 says that if there's no clear majority, then the House chooses the president from the top 5 choices by ballot, one ballot for each state. Well, who's in charge of the House of Representatives? Who's the Speaker of the House of Representatives? That's Henry Clay. Henry Clay is Speaker of the House. And if anybody can decide who's going to be president, the kingmaker, it's a person who's running for president, Henry Clay. Does that make sense? So we've got a four-way split in the election of 1824, and Henry Clay is at the head of the House and an excellent politician. And he goes from congressman to congressman to work out who's going to be president. And Clay recognizes that he's likely not going to be president, but he sits down with in John Quincy Adams's carriage. No one knows what was said in the carriage ride between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. But later assistants and things like that say that the two of them sit together and they discuss their vision of the future. Clay suggests that he and Adams don't differ that much. Their vision of the future is very similar. What is similar about Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams? What do they have in common? Why would they tend to agree on certain matters? Remember that Henry Clay is from the Northwest, John Quincy Adams is from the Northeast. What are they likely to have in common? Clay is in slaveholding region, Adams is not, so they don't agree about slavery. But what would they agree about, these two? Strong federal government, excellent. Right, and pro-Bank of the United States, excellent. So those are the things that they agree about. They don't agree about slavery, they don't agree about a bunch of other things, but they believe that there ought to be a strong federal government, and they believe that the Second Bank of the United States is a good institution. Okay? And so this is what Andrew Jackson is going to call the corrupt bargain. Clay goes back to the House and persuades the others that John Quincy Adams is the president, is the best president. At first, Jackson isn't particularly upset. He congratulates Adams on his victory, but then Adams immediately chooses as his Secretary of State Henry Clay. And Secretary of State is seen at the time as being the route to the presidency, right? Jefferson had been the Secretary of State under Washington. Um, Secretary of State is seen as the kind of path to power. And so once John Quincy Adams chooses Henry Clay as his Secretary of State, then Jackson is pissed. Men around Jackson call it a corrupt bargain. As Jackson returns to his home in Tennessee, he thinks it over. He delivers speeches along the way, and each one is angrier than the last one. The people have been cheated, he bellowed in Frankfort, Kentucky. Corruptions and intrigues in Washington have defeated the will of the people. John Quincy Adams is going to be the most important person for forming what becomes the Jacksonian Democrats. Why? He's the negative example. He forms a negative example for the Democratic Party. Adams' inaugural speech to Congress advocates internal improvements, like canals, to be funded by federal money. A strong system of credit, he argues, Bank of the United States. A series of astronomical observatories, which he calls lighthouses of the sky, which, by the way, happen to be in New England. He supports a national a university, which, by the way, happens to be Harvard, which he attended, which happens to be in New England. Adams is criticized for his bookishness and called the professor. Okay, now let's think about this. It's important to remember that every party is built on according to political scientists anyways, is built as a negative reference group, right? There's a negative reference group that organizes people around a party. So it's not necessarily what they support, but who they hate. Okay, let's think back. What parties, what party programs have been built around the hatred for a particular person in our experience? Okay, the Anti-Federalists. Okay, but what about in the present? Are there people? Yeah, right, exactly. It's literally the name. But in the present, think about today. Who is the what's the it's think about the how it is that the Republican Party today or the Democratic Party today campaigns. I don't want to get too political. But the Republican Party, an important part of what the Republican Party, the way it built itself, was not necessarily pro-Trump, it was anti-Hillary, right? Right. So the Republican Party literally doesn't have a platform, it's just opposition. They attack each other hard. Right. Trump's platform was people being sick of politicians. Likewise, the Democratic Party was built around opposition to Trump. So it's attacking the other party, right? Yeah, so it's career politicians, but there's a way in which what's called the negative reference group forms so when people talk about themselves as Republicans, they call themselves what is the term that Hillary used in that speech? In any event, there's a way in which focusing on the negative in the opponent is what drives people into a party. And John Quincy Adams, in a way, helps form the Democratic Party because opposite basket of deplorables. Excellent, thank you. So when people call themselves deplorables, they're calling on this sort of hatred of Hillary. And there's a similar thing that goes on here. It's the dislike for a professional politician like John Quincy Adams that helps form the Democratic Republicans. It's the hatred for John Quincy Adams that builds what we're going to call the Jacksonian Democrats or the Democratic Party. The previous party, the Democratic Republicans, splits into two divisions. On the one hand, the Democrats, and on the other hand, a group of people that is eventually going to be called the Whigs. Okay? The person who comes up with this idea is not Andrew Jackson, because Andrew Jackson is basically a fighter. It's this guy, Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren comes up with what we're going to call the second party system. He says Adams is in power and Clay is behind him. We need to form a new party that is built around the hatred of John Quincy Adams. And so There are certain issues that we can never discuss. One of those is slavery. If we discuss slavery, we will have war. We will have civil war. A party cannot be built around around opposition, support and opposition for slavery. It's too simple, and it's too dangerous. A fraction, a division based on North and South that puts northern states arrayed against southern states, Martin Van Buren is sure will lead to chaos and war. As a result, we need to create a new party system in which we, the Democrats, and Martin Van Buren is a Democrat, is going to support opposition to tariffs. That's a safe issue. John Quincy Adams likes tariffs. He believes that there ought to be certain industries that need to be protected, particularly New England industries. Henry Clay believes in internal improvements, and so as does Adams. Sorry. Okay. As does Clay. And so Martin Van Buren, who comes from Eastern New York, does not like tariffs. He knows that Southern planters believe that they are paying too much for manufactured goods, and that they will also support him. But there are other. Yeah, it might have been a safer issue if it had been evenly distributed, but as a result, it's not. And in a way, that's cotton, right? Cotton requires 200 frost-free days, right? You can't grow cotton unless you have 200 frost-free days in a row, and so you can just barely grow cotton in Virginia. You can grow cotton in North Carolina, and so the line of 3630 is between North and South is really the line of cotton. It's more like 3530, but in any event, a North-South line. That's in a way nature that to a certain nature and technology that to a certain extent are important there. But yeah, it would have been, slavery might have been a safer issue. It's possible it would have been a safer issue if it had not have been a North-South thing. Okay? And he also knows that Southern Democrats don't like the bank. And so if we form an anti-tariff, anti-bank organization, call it the Democratic Party, we can win the presidency. And so Martin Van Buren, who had previously supported Crawford, comes up to Andrew Jackson, and together they build this coalition that's going to be called the Democratic Party. On the other side are John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, who are going to support tariffs, who are going to support federal internal improvements. And so there's not going to be, and then you're going to have, there are pro-bank Southerners, right? People like, particularly on the coast of Virginia and South Carolina, who very strongly support the bank. And they're going to be in this other party. So we're going to have a party, but it's not, and we're going to argue about these things. Tariffs, internal improvements, land prices, banks, East versus West. All that's safe. Everything is safe there. The thing that's not safe is slavery. The thing that we'll never mention and never discuss is slavery. When Andrew Jackson becomes president, the thing that one of the earliest things that he's going to do is prevent the distribution of anti-slavery materials in the mails. Slavery will not be discussed in Congress. Any discussion of Congress in Congress that about ending slavery will immediately be tabled and never be reprinted in the annals of Congress. Why? Or Niles Register. Why? Because we don't want anti-slavery talk generating controversy in the South. Okay, so this becomes the election of 1828. And so the election of 1828, Andrew Jackson wins hands down. He wins a 68% of the electoral vote, 56% of the popular vote. He effectively sweeps the country. Adams still does well in New England, but he loses Eastern New York. Adams gets, New England, New Jersey, and Western New York. Okay. His vice president is John C. Calhoun. Now, both of them are slaveholders. Both of them have big hair. Both of them are white. Both of them are rich. You would think that they wouldn't have anything to disagree about. But ultimately, they're going to disagree about a lot. This is the big-haired white Southerners tour. And they come together. Doesn't he? Yeah, he's a madman. There's no question that so this is John C. Calhoun. Jackson and Calhoun are going to be elected together in 1828. Martin Van Buren is the person who's going to be engineer this whole thing. Okay, and so in 1828, Andrew Jackson wins. Yeah, he is a strange looking dude. I mean, part of it is that you have to hold very, very still for photographs. So this is an early photograph, and you had to sit still for like 5 minutes without moving a muscle. And so, to a certain extent, that all pictures look a little bit like that. But yeah, he does look like an action figure. Okay, so let's step back a little bit. Right? He was 6'1" and 140 pounds. Okay, rail thin. Okay, yeah, he does. There's actually, I'm going to talk about the threat of slavery and other stuff like that a little bit. I want to take your questions. But after Jackson becomes president, he is given an honorary degree at Harvard. John Quincy Adams is irate that Andrew Jackson is going to be given a degree at Harvard. And he says, what's he going to do? He's a barbarian. He's a buffoon. He's going to embarrass himself. And the thing about Harvard is that if you give it an honorary degree, you have to give a speech in Latin. And so everybody is waiting to see what Andrew Jackson is going to say. what everybody's going to say when Andrew Jackson gets up to the speak. When he gets up to the speech, he says, "Sic semper tyrannis." No. He says, "E pluribus unum, gentlemen." And then he sits down. He's no. There's another something he says. I don't know. I messed up the joke. It's not a joke, but he basically says 6 words in Latin, and then he sits down and he takes his degree. Yeah, 6. E pluribus unum is, and then sine qua non. That's the other one. So he says, E pluribus unum, which means out of many, one, which is a strong central government, right? Out of many states, there will be one. And then, sine qua non, which means absolutely necessary. So basically, there has to be a strong national. It's out of many states, one, absolutely necessary. So that is Jackson. Are there questions about this election? So this is Jacksonian democracy. It is. E pluribus unum is the motto of the United States. And sine qua non is basically without it we would fail. So that's basically the takeaway from this. All right, other questions about Jackson. So we talked. Let me just review because we did a lot of stuff today. Rufus King's 1819 speech in opposition to slavery is picked up by Denmark Vesey and leads to a slave revolt that doesn't ever quite happen and leads to a growing fear among slaveholders that education and free blacks and other things are dangerous. And so education is denied to African Americans after this, and free blacks are barred from southern states, and they're strongly restricted in southern states, and many of them have to go to the north if they are freed. the South Carolina passes a Negro Seamen's Act, and we see increasingly a fear on the part of slaveholders that a federal government is going to potentially interfere with slavery as the peculiar institution. A four-way division over Democratic Republican principles is going to lead to a deal which brings Adams to the White House. And that deal is going to so anger people, many, many people, that it's going to create a new party system. That new party system that Martin Van Buren comes up with is going to be Democrats versus Whigs. The issues are going to be everything but slavery. People are going to argue about tariffs, argue about internal improvements, argue about land prices, argue about banks, but they're not going to argue about slavery. In the same period, over the Jacksonian period, there are all these threats to slavery. One is the boom-bust cycle, and the other is the increasing turn against slavery in other parts of the Americas. Ultimately, Andrew Jackson is going to come to power by this, Van Buren's wedge, the creation of these issues that are going to bring the Democrats and Republicans to power. We'll talk about Andrew Jackson's war against the bank next class. Other questions? All right, thanks. Oh, yeah, I'll talk about it more in class, but basically, Jackson's argument is that these people, Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, the lawyers, and Nicholas Biddle, all brought about the financial panic of 1819. And so it's not an issue in the first campaign in 1828, but after he wins in 1828, he's going to call on memories of the panic of 1819, and he's going to say that the bank itself caused the panic of 1819, and only he can prevent future financial panics. We'll talk more about this anti-bank strategy next class, when Jackson's war on what he calls the monster bank is going to define his presidency after 1828. Another version of this is going to be in my book, Nation of Deadbeats, which I talk about this. One essay, yes, an exam. Thanks, everybody.